Hey guys, hope you're having a great day. Today is our Abundantly Blessed series. It's the part of the week that we are reading God's Word together. So I'm in my house. It's actually really quiet, somewhat quiet. I've got dishwasher and washer and dryer going, but I don't normally have a quiet house. The last one I did, it was actually quiet. I'm like, this is good. And so I started filming, and then next scene started. I've got beef jerky dehydrating, so she started like going a little crazy in here, and then she wants to play ball, and I'm like, if I don't have child making noise, it's dog making noise. So, but I got her downstairs, so I think we're gonna be good to keep going. So we are reading the Old Testament. We are in the book. Last week we read the book of Nehemiah, and we got to see how just an everyday person can make a difference for the world and for the kingdom. And so this week we're reading on Esther. So I know maybe some of you know the story of Esther and what she did. So we're going to read a little bit here and see if anything pops out to us that we can, apply to our lives. So I'm reading from the ESV version. Read from whatever version you'd like. This is just what I'm reading from, and we're just going to get going. You guys ready? All right. Chapter 1, the King's Banquets. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, Ahasuerus, who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days, when the king sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army and the nobles and the governors were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, actually 180 days. Can you imagine going on and being so, what's the word? Pomp, I like that. No, what's the word? Being a little showy, like, hey, look at me and my 180 days of my great wealth. Never good. And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa the citadel, both great and small, a feast, and it lasted for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There was white cotton curtains and violets hanging, fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of marble, mother pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion, for the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. It's never a good thing when you give to each man his own desires. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to the king. Queen Vashti's refusal. So on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry, because he'd been drinking for, this long time, with wine, he commanded his people and the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. At this the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for this was the king's procedure toward all who were versed in law and judgment, and they told the men that was with them, and they said, according to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti, because she has not performed the command of king delivered by the eunuchs? So then the people said, or not people, it's the king and the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the people who are in all the provinces of the king. For the queen's behavior will be made to know all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt. Hello, hello, hello. Now, this is not how God planned life to be. So remember that when we're reading the story, it's not that God is saying, here, this is how I want the kings to act, and this is how you're supposed to act. No, he's given you the story, and you're going to see how God moved through through Esther. We're going to find out here. All right. So the queen's favor will be made to know all women, causing them to look at contempt on their husbands. Hello. Since they will sing, the king commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's behavior, will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. If it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before the king. I would be like, yes. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. Well, that's not very good, but maybe she's out of it, so maybe that's okay. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. So we already know this is wrong. That's why it's here. This advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as the guy proposed. He sent letters to all the royal princes, to every province in his own script, and to every person in his own language, that every man be master in his own household and speak according to the language of his people. Again, this is man's view, not God's. Esther is chosen queen. After these things, when the anger of the king had abated, he remembered Vashti. Well, yeah, and what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, let some beautiful young virgins be set up for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of the kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, under custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This pleased the king. Of course it did, and he did so. Now there was a Jew in the citadel whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, bunch of sons of Benjamin, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with the ZIRCONIA king of Judah. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. This young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel in custody of Hegai, Esther also was taken to the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. And the young women pleased him and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not been made known like her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Now when the turn came for the young women to go into the king, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, this was the regular period of their beautifying. They had 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with spices and ointments for women, so that they smelled delicious. Ugh. When the young women went into the king, now this is the world, remember this is not God, this is the world. When the young woman went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of one of the king's eunuchs, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. So when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Mordecai, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to the king into his royal palace in the 10th month, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. He's much happier, so he's a little more kinder, right? Mordecai discovers a plot. Now when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, there was 2 of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on the king. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found out to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. All right, change the battery up. Got this going on. Floppy hair, it's all good. Chapter 3, Haman's plot against the Jews. After these things, the king promoted Haman and the son of Haman, and advanced him and all his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" And when they spoke to him day after day, he would not listen to them. They told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of the king. In the first month, they cast their lots before Haman day after day, and they cast it month after month till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Then Haman said to the king, "There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from yours, those of other peoples, and they do not keep the king's law, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasury." So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, and said, "The money is given to you, the people also to do with them as it seems good to you." Right? So it seems good to you, not to God. Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and an edict according to all that Haman commanded was written to the kings and to the governors of all the provinces, and it was written in the name of the king and sealed with his ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king provinces with instruction to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month. A copy was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all the people. The couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued to all the people. And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. Chapter 4. Esther agrees to help the Jews. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai, so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for one of the eunuchs who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go get Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. So he went out to get him, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and to explain it to her, and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. And Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, "All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" That's a great line, right? Who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Think about that in your own life. Like, how do you know God doesn't have you placed? Like, some of you may be going through job issues and maybe relationship issues, and I'm not talking ones that are toxic and ones that you need to get out, but sometimes there's a little bit of frustration and something will happen and you're like, what do I even do? The first thing is to jump out. Maybe church issues. How about that one? Church issues. God tells you to go to a church, you're there, and then you start feeling that little bit of, everything that you feel when your flesh gets in the way. That's the word. But he said, how do you know that whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? You might just be in that job for such a time as this. You might just be in that church for such a time as this. The key is to go on the Lord's leading, right? So it says, "Go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days. I and my young women will also fast, that I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Then Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. So here, now, she's taking an approach to God to ask what to do, not doing her own things, what God is asking her to do. So Esther prepares a banquet. Chapter 5. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robe and stood in the inner courts of the king's palace in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Shall be given you, even to the half of my kingdom." And Esther said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I prepared for the king." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther had asked." So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. And as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your wish?" So she didn't jump right away and just beg and beg and beg. She patiently waited for the right time, right? It says, "Whatever you wish, it shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Esther answered, "My wish and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." So Haman plans to hang Mordecai. And Haman went out that day joyfully and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and brought his friends and his wife. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. Then Haman said, "Even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast she prepared. And tomorrow also I am invited by her together with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me as long as I see Mordecai, that Jew, sitting at the king's gate." So here he is. He's angry, because none of that matters, right? Even though God has you in a position, it doesn't matter because you're worried about that one little thing. Don't get distracted, right? Don't get distracted by clouds going by in your life. Okay. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast." This idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. The king honors Mordecai. On that night the king could not sleep, and he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about the Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who had guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on king. And the king said, "Oh, what honor and distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this." I like that, book of memorable deeds. We need a book of memorable deeds of everything that God does. That's a good thing. So he says, the king's young men who had attended said, "Nothing has been done for him." And the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai. And the king's young men told him, "Haman is there standing in the court. Let him come in." So he told him to come in. He said, "What should be done to this man whom the king delights in honor?" And Haman said to himself, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" And Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robe and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights in honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.' Then the king says to Haman, 'Hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned.' So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city. Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house mourning with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all of his friends everything that had happened. Then his wise men and his wife said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but you will surely fall before him." Esther reveals Haman's plot. While they were yet talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. So the king and Haman went into the feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the second day, the king again said to Esther, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your sight, and if it please the king, let my life be granted for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, and I and my people to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king." Then the king said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he, and who dared to do this?" And Esther said, "A foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. Right? The pride comes before a fall. Yes. Haman is hanged. And the king arose in the wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" As the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house. Hang him on it." And they hung Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated. Chapter 8. Esther saves the Jews. On that day the king gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. And Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. When the king held out the scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king and said, "If it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son, which he wrote to destroy all the Jews. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people, or how can I bear to see the destruction?" Then the king said to Queen, "Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him in the gallows, because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked." The king's scribes were summoned at that time, and an edict was written, according to all that Mordecai commanded, and concerning the Jews, to the governors and the officials. And he wrote in the name of the king that he sent the letters by mounted couriers all to everybody, and said, the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, to annihilate any armed forces. On one day throughout all the province of the king, a copy, they put that, the couriers mounted and did it. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown, and a robe of fine linen and purple, and the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and every city, wherever the king's command with his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the people of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. Chapter 9. The Jews destroy their enemies. Now in the 12th month, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on that very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, the Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the provinces of the king to lay hands on those who sought them harm, and no one could stand against them, for the fear of them had fallen on all the people. All the officials in the provinces and the governors and the royal agents also helped the Jews, for the fear of Mordecai had fallen on them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for the man Mordecai grew more and more powerful. The Jews struck all the enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. The Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, and that very day the number of those killed in Susa was reported to the king. And the king said to Queen, "In Susa, the citadel, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men, and also the 10 sons of Haman. When they had done in the rest of the king's, what then have they done to the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your wish? It shall be granted you, and what further is your request? It shall be fulfilled." And Esther said, "If it please the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict, and let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows." So the king commanded this to be done. A decree was issued, and the Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 14th day, but they laid no hands on the plunder. And they killed 300 men. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's province also gathered to defend their lives, and got relief from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they laid no hands on the plunder. This was on the 13th day. But the Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 13th day, and on the 14th, and rested on the 15th, making that a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages who live in the royal towns hold the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day of gladness and feasting, as a holiday, and as a day on which they send gifts of food to one another. The feast of Purim is inaugurated. And Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of the king, both near and far, obliging them to keep the 14th day of the month of Adar as the days in which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and in the month that they had been turned from them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted what they had started to do, and when Mordecai had written to them, for Haman the son had cast lots to crush and to destroy them. But when it came down before the king, he gave orders in writing that this evil plan that he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore they call this day Purim, after that term pure. Therefore, because of all that was written in this letter and of what they had faced in the matter and of what had happened to them, the Jews firmly obligated themselves and their offspring, all who joined them, that without fail they would keep these days according to what was written at the time appointed every year. And these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation and every clan, that these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. Then Queen Esther gave full written authority confirming the second letter about Purim. Letters were sent to all the Jews in the 127 provinces that these days of Purim should be observed. And the command of Esther confirmed these practices of Purim, and it was recorded in writing. Chapter 10, the greatness of Mordecai. The king imposed tax on the land and on the coastlands of the sea, and all the acts of his power and might, and the full account of high honor of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to the king, and he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. That's a good chapter, or good book. I love that. So what did he do? He sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. And then the verse that I like, how do you know that this is not at such a time as this, right? And I love how she approached the king, and every time she did it with not arrogancy, not demanding, not out of anger. She said it with true humility, right? And that's a good thing to do. I was looking for that verse that says, who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. For such a time as this. That's probably one of my favorite verses, or one of the one that really stuck out to me. You don't know what your situation in life is and how it can impact others around you. And you have to go, okay, God, what is this time in my life? And is this such a time as this for me to make an impact when I think I'm not doing a whole lot? That's what we need to be asking ourselves in the Lord today. All right, next thing I had to come up here. So that was a great chapter. That was a great chapter for us to be reminded to think about our position and where God has us. And God will move you up like he moved Esther up, and where he moved Mordecai. He was like second with the king. Second, wasn't he second? He was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers. And he was second in rank to the king. How do you get second? How do you get second when you're serving the Lord? Because God will move you into that position to make that difference where you're at. So you have to remember that. Yes, you do. All right, so the next chapter is Job. So that's going to be a good book to read. I like Job, a lot of that. There's a lot of good things to read in there. So let's do, I know I tell you what to read beforehand, but I think a lot of you just read along with that. So I'm going to say, let's aim for like 15, but when we're reading along, we'll see how far we get doing it together, and how long it takes. I don't want to go too long. I find like 40 minutes, 45 minutes seems like enough time to read where I don't get tired and you don't get tired of listening to me. So we'll keep it that way, but it's going to be a lot about Job, and Job's going to be lamenting a lot, I think, in here, and Satan's going to attack, and we're going to see how the enemy is going to work in a person's life through that. So let's pray, and then you guys can go about your days. Does that sound good? All right. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, Lord. Thank you for this time and opportunity to come together and read your word, Lord. Love reading these words from the book of Esther, Lord. Love seeing the hand of God move in a situation that just seems like impossible, and just like, what can God do? But we know that you can do so many great things, Lord. But the key is we have to be willing and obedient to do them. And for those that are questioning their place in life, and those questioning, am I making a difference here? Should I change jobs? Should I move churches? Should I not be with these group of friends, Lord? If this is going to be for such a time as this, Lord, put it inside them to have peace to stay. To have peace to stay and continue doing the work that you have for them, Lord Jesus. And we love you so much. Thank you again for this wonderful opportunity to be able to read your word and grow and learn together. In your precious name we pray. Amen. All right. So you guys have a fantastic rest of your Saturday. I'm going to be at church on Sunday. If you guys want to go check out my church, Upward Christian Fellowship, I'll be there worshiping online with you this week. And then we'll see you guys again on Monday for another day in our lives. So, all right, we'll see you tomorrow, maybe. And if not, we'll see you Monday for sure. All right.